Hi, my name is Christina Higgens. I am a certified medical support clinical hypnotherapist and NLP practitioner, and I'm currently practicing here in San Diego, California. I have a practice called San Diego Clinical Hypnotherapy, but I also work with people worldwide via Skype and phone. What I'm doing here today is talking about hypnosis and the power of the subconscious mind. So I give a little bit more of an explanation of that. So first, let's talk a little bit about hypnosis and what that is and some of the myths surrounding that. So people have a lot of ideas about what hypnosis is and isn't. Simple, basic definition is that it is a natural altered state. Nothing more, nothing less. Most altered states that people are familiar with tend to be drug or alcohol induced. This is a natural altered state that actually occurs to everyone anyways, regardless of therapeutic circumstances, unless maybe they've had a serious brain injury that precludes them from entering that altered state. So it's basically happening to you every day, multiple times a day. A simple explanation of that altered state would be, let's say you drive the same route home and you get home and you're like, okay, I don't remember any of that drive. I just kind of zoned out. Well, that zone out state is hypnosis. And it's happening to everybody various times a day at different levels. So just like any altered state, there are various levels to that altered state. And so some of the common misconceptions that happen with hypnosis is that some people will say that perhaps, hey, I don't think I was hypnotized because I remember what happened in that session. And I'm like, or something to that effect. Well, that's maybe as ridiculous as saying you didn't have anything to drink last night because you didn't get blackout drunk. Well, there are altered states and there are altered states. Just like any other altered state, there are varying degrees to the level of an altered state. So, in a session, generally the practitioner will take you to the level that they need you to be for that particular session. Memory is not indicative of being in an altered state or being in the hypnotic state. So just like any other altered state. So you can be relaxed, but you can still remember things. Another common myth that comes with hypnosis is that people think it's a form of mind control. No, actually can't really make you do or say things that you don't want to. You actually have to be very, very willing to come in and work on whatever you're coming in to work on. When you actually would come in to see me, I actually have you sign papers that say co-therapist when you come in. Because I can have as many skills as I have in my toolkit, but if you don't actually want to be fully working on what you're wanting to be working on, it's not going to work. The willingness and the full desire to be wanting to change is absolutely necessary in order for this to work. Because it's the power of your subconscious that actually does the work. Now that said, since hypnosis is just the fancy word for the state, what a hypnotherapist does once in that state is going to vary sometimes drastically depending on the level of skill, training, and education of the therapist. So hypnosis, again, just a word for the state. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the skills or techniques that are employed by the therapist. So what I do, for example, versus what 20 other therapists in the same city may be doing, may vary somewhat drastically. Depending on where they went to school or what their personality education background would be. A lot of hypnotherapists nowadays tend to be using a bit more of a passive approach, suggestion-based therapy, where they put you in a relaxing state and do more suggestion-based therapies. If you come to see me, I generally am using a little bit more of an NLP type-based technique. I treat the mind much more kind of like a computer. So I see my job a bit more like a computer upgrader, computer programmer. So taking out what doesn't need to be there, putting in what needs to be there, and trying to really look at it in that way. So it's a bit more of an active approach. You're much more involved, and I try always to find the most effective techniques that I can. So now let's talk about this very powerful tool that we are dealing with. I do kind of compare it to a computer because I find that nowadays that's the best analogy that we do have to compare it with. Obviously much more powerful than any computer that there is out there. But just like any computer, it does have to be programmed. The initial age of programming for this powerful computer that we are dealing with does tend to be between the ages of 7 and 11, the conscious programming. And that is when the child is deciding what means what, who they are in relation to the world, and so on. And most of that programming itself is being taken on by whatever's around them in the world at that time, generally via authority figures, peer groups, maybe traumatic events, repetition, and anything else that happens to be going on that is of significance in their lives. And it's just kind of taken on as a byproduct at that time. Now, the unfortunate part of this is that most people really don't understand at this point in time in human evolution how computer-like they really are. And so for all intents and purposes, what they then do is they take that initial programming and they go and then operate on that programming for the rest of their lives, which is an incredibly, incredibly unfortunate thing, because then you've got adults walking around on programming that was instilled by a child who had very, very little knowledge of the world in general, which makes very little sense at all. So by the time they come in to see someone like me, they're very confused and confounded, because they're like, well, I don't know why I always operate like this, or why when this happens I always react like this. Well, it's not because your mind is trying to trip you up or trying to do something nefarious to you. It's because it is simply operating on the last programming that got stuck in there, and that's it. So all that needs to be done is it needs to be given an upgrade. If something isn't functioning well, then that programming needs to be taken out, and what you do want needs to be put in. At this point in your life, there can be a good amount of conscious thought put into that, and you say, this doesn't work for me, I'm not happy with that, so I don't want that in there, and I do want something else in there. And so that can happen, and it is very, very effective and efficient, but it has to be done at the subconscious level. So what happens is, at that age generally, is an event will happen that creates a belief, then leads to an emotion, leads to behavior, and then leads to a result. Now, obviously, we can't go back in and change that initial event happened, and I don't help people amend memories of events. I don't find that that's ecological. But what we can do is we can change the belief itself. Now, by changing that belief itself, that changes the whole rest of that pattern, the emotion, behavior, and results. So, for example, if someone created a belief that they're stupid based on something that happened when they were in the first grade, and so now every time they get in front of people, then they have a problem with public speaking, and so now they're terrified of public speaking. So we go in and we change that belief. That takes that away. Generally, these types of things, I see the results, but generally between 1 and 6 sessions. For fears and phobias, often a lot less, just because of the nature of the techniques that we're involved with. So what happens is, since the subconscious is an association-making mechanism, which is for the ease of our use, because if we had to make an association every time we did something, which meant we had to learn how to walk again, learn how to pick up a pen, learn how to do something every single time, it would get ridiculous. And so for the ease of our use, the subconscious actually makes associations, but sometimes those associations are incorrect. So for example, just like the person I mentioned, if that association was incorrect and the person decided, because they had that bad experience in first grade with public speaking, and now they decided they're stupid, and so now every time they get in front of people, they think they're stupid and they're terrified of it, well, that association is going to keep on running, and they're going to keep having those emotions every single time, and that association is going to keep on running and repeating those emotions and repeating the same pattern until it's broken at the subconscious level. But the really cool thing is it can be done very, very quickly and very easily and very efficiently, but again, it has to be done at the subconscious level. All right, so now let's get down and talk about the conscious mind. So the conscious mind does actually have a few things in it. It has a few useful things in it. Not as many as the subconscious, but it does have a few things. So what we're talking with and what you're listening to me with right now is the conscious mind. It has things like analysis, choice, your reasoning, your logic, your willpower, your 5 senses. Now, yes, some people do have stronger willpower than others, and they can last out longer with willpower. That said, if a change is not made at the subconscious level, willpower is never enough to make it a permanent and lasting change. Changes must be made at the subconscious level in order to make it permanent and lasting. which makes it really cool and easy, because if you make a change at the subconscious level, then you're no longer battling against yourself trying to do something that you don't want to. So it makes it a whole lot easier to do it from that way anyways. Also, you'll note that rationale and logic are firmly in the conscious mind. They're not in the subconscious mind. And now this is particularly important to note, especially in this line of work. Remember I mentioned that when we do hypnosis, often you're in a relaxed state, but your conscious mind is still there. It's not completely knocked out. So some people have a tendency to want to get their conscious mind a little bit engaged, and they want to try and solve issues with their conscious mind. Now, here's the problem with that. A, if you could have solved the issue with your conscious mind, you would have already done that, right? Let's just be honest. B, the conscious mind doesn't have access to even an eighth of the data that is in the subconscious mind. So, trying to use the conscious mind to solve issues that are in the subconscious mind makes about as much sense as looking at one piece of a puzzle when the picture is actually about that big, which in the end makes no rational or logical sense at all. So basically, you're chasing your tail, you're losing time and money, which I appreciate, but actually I'm much more interested in results and efficiency, and in the end I would prefer that you have the positive results. So I always recommend let go of the rationale, let go of the logic, and go with the first thing that pops into your head. The first thing, the first image, the first word, the first expression, the first anything that pops into your head, because that's coming from your subconscious mind. When you go with the subconscious answers, that's when you get results, and that's when you get the real answers. And the more you trust that, the more they'll come up. All right, so now let's go down to the subconscious mind, which in the big picture controls everything else. It controls your autonomic nervous system. It's in charge of fight or flight. It has memory storage, every memory that's ever happened, whether you consciously recall it or not. It's extremely literal. So that means we have to be very careful about our self-talk. So I know a lot of us like to say things to ourselves when we make mistakes, and you break something, you're like, oh man, I'm so stupid, or something like that. Well, we have to be careful of those things, because the things that we say in our head are means of programming. Now, if you add in repetition is also a means of programming. So we have to be very careful about the things that we say to ourselves, because they are definitely means of programming. Now, conversely, if you notice that those things come up unbidden anyways, even though you don't want to be saying them, then go ahead and make note of those, because those are limiting beliefs that already exist there at the subconscious level that we should probably root out. Take those out and put in the ones that should be there. And that's something I also specialize in, getting those limiting beliefs out and putting in putting the real ones, the true ones that should be there. And everybody has them. So it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's inevitable that we took on some limiting beliefs when we were children. So, but it is worth noting. And be careful. Be mindful of the things that you say to yourself. All right. Now we get down to what I consider to be the most important part of this entire thing and why this works as well as it does. So the subconscious doesn't discern fact from fantasy. And it's also the seat of your imagination. Now these two, in my opinion, are the reasons this whole thing works as well as it does. So every computer has a computer programming language, which I personally don't speak, but I can still use a computer. I type on the keyboard, it does something magical behind the screen, and I'm using the computer without actually knowing how it's doing that, right? So it's the same with this, okay? So this computer here is running everything about us. It's controlling our mind, it's controlling our body, it's controlling our heart. It's doing all of these things without us even knowing how it's doing all of that. So there's actually no scientist alive who knows how it's doing all of those things, and there's no scientist alive who knows what we're entirely capable of yet as a human species. But just like the other computer, it's not actually necessary to know how it's doing all those things in order to be able to interact with it. But we actually do need to know how to interact with it in order to have the best results. And obviously there's no keyboard, right? So just like a computer that's in sleep mode, it's going to be running on certain systems without us doing anything to it. And our computer is going to be running certain systems without us telling it to do anything. But it's going to be a lot more beneficial if we actually open that computer up out of sleep mode and start directing it by typing on it and telling it what we want it to do. Because really, our computers right now are not psychic. And it's the same with us. If we direct our computer what we want it to do, the results are much more astronomical. And so let's get down to what the language is. Obviously, there's no keyboard for this. So what is the language? How do we direct it? Well, the language of this very, very powerful tool inside of us is imagination and fantasy based. And this is why children have such an easy time at this line of work. I can see a child for 20 minutes said and done because all they have to do is imagine it and it becomes reality. Medical stories tend to be really good examples of this for people for adults, because it seems to be a really good, solid example of that. For example, a friend of mine who's a clinical hypnotherapist, but she wasn't back then, was in a serious, serious car accident in the country she was in. She fractured her skull in multiple places. One eye was out of the socket, and her jaw was hanging down. At the hospital, they said, there's nothing we can do for you. You should go home and be comfortable and wait to die there when clear fluid is flowing from your nose. That's cranial fluid, and you know death is imminent. So she went home to wait to die. Her mother was freaking out, calling up every neurosurgeon and neurologist that she could find in that country, and finally happened upon a neurologist that was also a hypnotherapist. So he evaluated her medically and otherwise, and he said, no, there's nothing we can do for you medically at the moment, but I will work with you several times a week with hypnosis. So he started to create some recordings for her, but it was especially important that she create her own imagery for herself, because all of his doctor lingo wasn't going to make any sense in her mind. So she created the imagery that there were little tiny angels with golden needles sewing things back into place. Now obviously she knew, and we know, that there are actually no little tiny angels in there sewing things back into place, but it doesn't matter. Since the mind controls the body, and the mind controls the mind, it already knows how to do these things, but it doesn't know that you want it to do it unless you tell it to. Just like that computer doesn't know what I want until I type on it. Now this is why the American Medical Association and the American Psychological Association and the British counterparts have been doing more and more studies with hypnosis lately. And the results are always astronomically different. I mean, we're talking broken bones heal an average of weeks faster. A person with a mastectomy, with having hypnosis preparation ahead of time, saves them thousands of dollars. They heal faster. They leave the hospital faster. I even watched a surgery done on this guy for 6 hours, with his leg cut into for 6 hours. He was in a light altered state, talking to the staff the whole time, and no anesthesia. And he got up and walked out on the leg afterwards. I still don't know how advisable that was, but regardless to say, we don't really know what our entire potential as a human species is as of yet. Back to my friend, long story short, she actually didn't need any surgery either. Her eye even eventually went back into the socket. She was completely blind. Then she started seeing grays, and then full vision came back. Now knowing the story, I can see a slight difference between one eye and the other, but not knowing it, I would have no idea. And she was so blown away that she became a hypnotherapist, and that's how we met. I mean, there's so many of these stories. I mean, I had a client here just in San Diego who was hit by a car crossing the road, and he had screws all in his leg, and they were told him it would take months and months before he could walk normally. And so we met. He'd been a previous client of mine, and he created his own imagery of little dwarves in there repairing the damage. And after the second session, the little dwarves were repairing the damage, and I asked him, how did the dwarves doing? And he said, well, I did like you said, and got up the other night and told them to get back to work. And he said, but they threw up their hands and they said, but we're done. We could use some magic, but we're all done. He said, I was very confused by the response, but I had to go back into the doctor for some more imaging tests. And when I did on Tuesday, went in and they said they couldn't find any example of any of the fractures at all. And he said they'd never seen anything heal so fast. And that was after the little dwarf guys had said that they were done. And so my point in telling these stories to adults is to really sink it in how important the imagination and fantasy part in what we do is, because far from childlike, it is the language of the most powerful part of your being. The more you use it, the more real results you get, because what you imagine becomes real. As adults, and especially as people, we tend to imagine the worst case scenarios, and more often than not, we end up getting more of what we don't want. The more we imagine of what we do, this is what we get. And so this is what we help you tap into here. All right, so the subconscious, imagination, the seat of your imagination, it also stores your beliefs and scripts. And so the more we clear the subconscious and make it more positive, the more access we have to the place where you have your kind of higher self, and which gives you more access to problem-solving intelligence, universal mind, love, forgiveness, healing, peace, intuition, inspired creativity, grace. All of that good stuff just starts to come out more naturally when we clear all of the negative beliefs and things out of the way. The subconscious is also an association-making mechanism, as we discussed. So we can break those negative associations and create positive ones there. And it also influences the personality. Now, I know I've covered a whole lot of information real briefly, just to give a little bit of background. If you're welcome to also ask me questions personally when you come into my office or make appointments by Skype. But this is just to give a little bit of a background, just how powerful the subconscious really is, and how many things that are absolutely capable. And just because you haven't tapped into it yet doesn't mean it's not possible. And just because that you've had an issue for your entire life doesn't mean it takes that long to deal with it. It just means that you haven't accessed that power that you're sitting on yet.